and welcome back. You're tuned in to Healthwise here on RTV, KDCG. I'm your host, Melanie Lee, and we've been speaking with Dr. Ronnie Daigle, dermatologist from Lafayette, and thanks for being on Healthwise this evening. We were talking about the sunlight and, of course, its effect on our skin, but there are other factors out there, other things in our environment that also have an impact on skin, things like plants and insects.
Oh, absolutely, sure. Your skin is the first barrier to the world. That's how you interface. Now, when you get an allergic reaction, or when you get a contact dermatitis, that means something came in contact with your skin. Now, there's an irritant contact dermatitis, which would be like a burning plant, hot grease, acid would burn you. That's an irritant contact. Allergic contact dermatitis requires a host response. So what you're allergic to, I might not be allergic to. So if we both touch the same thing, they could irritate each of us because we have a human skin that's a living organ. But whether you're allergic to something has to do with your immunity response. And so you may not react to poison ivy, but you might react to pink eyeshadow or deodorants. So it has to do with what your body will allow you to interact with. And you can become allergic to something you previously used for years. People say, well, I've been pulling down poison ivy for all my life and it never bothered me, and then suddenly it turns against you. Well, you develop a hypersensitivity to something, and when your skin perceives that chemical on you, you send an immunity reaction directed toward it to make it unwelcome. Like you're supposed to be making unwelcome bacteria, funguses, yeast, viruses, and cancer cells, because the immunity system works through the skin to fight things off. You get an infection, a bacterial infection, a fungal infection, a viral infection. The immunity system's supposed to go and look at that, because that would be something that could hurt you. But the same immunity system that fights the noxious things also will fight a bug bite reaction or a plant reaction or whatever else you come in contact with. So it's an integration of a living organ with the immunity system that keeps us healthy. One step beyond the inflammations are certainly malignancies. You're talking about sunlight earlier. If you get a mutated cell in your skin from a sunburn, it can happen decades after the fact. In fact, you don't get a skin cancer at 50 from a sunburn at 49. You get a skin cancer at 50 from a sunburn at 9. So that cell got mutated as a child when you got a bad sunburn. It's up to the immunity system to find that cell when it mutates and go and kill it when it's singular. Because if you don't kill it, that one cell will turn into 2, those 2 turn into 4, and they begin to clone up. But ultimately, it's not to get the mutated cell in the first place, but then have an immunity system that's astute enough to pick up and go get it before it turns into something of a bigger deal.
So that much of a time span can actually lapse before something would come about.
Absolutely.
From a sunburn.
Absolutely, decades.
So it kind of sends an alarm out. To,
well, the repeated sunburns too are very important, Melanie, because every time you get a blistering sunburn, you double your risk of skin cancer statistically. So the chance only may have been 1 in 100, but then it's 2 in 100, 4 in 100, 8 in 100. Every time you double your risk. And again, the older people that come in and they get skin cancers eating their ears and noses off, it's like a sore that won't heal. And they'll say, well, man, how I caught that? Well, you didn't catch it. It's a reaction to the sun. Oh, no, doc, I never go out in the sun. You don't have to. For 80 years, you were out in the sun every day of your life. Now you're sitting in the house showing the consequence because the damage is done prior and the manifestation occurs years later. Part of that because the cumulative damage reaches a threshold, but more importantly is that the immunity system loses its edge enough to pick up on these cells that start mutating. So anything that knocks the immunity system down will give those cancer cells a pass. People who are on immunosuppressive drugs, people who have kidney transplants, people with AIDS, people with leukemia on chemotherapy, the immunity system's beaten down. So these cells have been incubating for years, and suddenly they're turned loose with no address being given to them by the immunity system. That's why older people get more malignancies anyway, because the immunity system it kind of poops out a little bit with age.
You mentioned, showing up on ear or nose. Are there more common places where it will show up, or
malignancies? Yes. Well, certainly, you're covered part of the time. Yeah, the face and ears. I mean, men are almost always exposed. So yeah, head and neck cancers are pretty common.
And then of course you had a great point when you mentioned that you could be wearing a hat, but your ears weren't. Your ears were still exposed and not protected.
A hat will protect them, but a cap will not, and a visor will not.
So if somebody thinks or suspects, does it start with a simple freckle, or give us some kind of explanation of somebody that may think that they've got, is it just a small sore that won't heal, or a red dot? What should people look for?
Well, you look for things that don't fit. You have to know your own body, and you don't have to know good from bad. You just have to know different. Certainly, teenagers get pimples. You don't automatically think of skin cancers. But a 60-year-old comes in with a pimple on the face that's been there for 6 months. You really question, well, what's wrong with this pimple? So basically, a sore that won't heal in a sun-exposed area, a lesion that's pigmented. People get freckles. Johnny gets freckles at 6 years old. Granny gets big freckles at 94. Now, she calls hers liver splotches and old age splotches. But if you want to see Granny's skin really at 94, you pull up her sleeve and you look right here on the inside of her forearm. It's soft like a baby's butt. That's white, soft skin, unaltered. That's Granny's age. This is her activity. Because where the sun didn't hit you, you don't age like that. The sun hits you and these pigment cells turn on. They don't do it evenly, they do it focally, so you get darker spots. And the more light they absorb, the darker they get. The darker they get, the more light they absorb. But those aren't pre-malignant in and of themselves, but you judge them by the company they keep. Now, you have 20 on each hand, and one of them starts to look kind of weird. It looks black, it looks irregular, it's changing texture. It leaves the fold. What makes it different could make it dangerous. So you have to know what's normal for you to have a baseline of suspicion. But basically, a sore that won't heal in a sun-exposed area, given an adequate chance, is of suspicion. And something black, you really can't ignore black things. As a Caucasian, particularly light-eyed people, you see something black and it's not ink or paint, it should send up a little bit of a red flag.
So, and going back to the other things aside from the sun that will affect our skin, and you mentioned that we can have allergic reactions to products that we've used for years, and you hear of this with detergents and soaps.
Oh yes, very common.
Very common.
Very commonly. And one of the big offenders is fabric softeners that are put into the dryer. It's counterintuitive. You've just washed these clothes, you've rinsed them, you've spun them down, they're clean, they're damp. You throw them in the dryer and you throw a sheet of chemical to cook into the clothing. And when you pull out the clothes, they're contaminated with this chemical, but they smell good and they don't cling together. Well, sometimes you get a rash from these clothes that are chemically cooked with this fabric softener. So it's like, do you want static cling? You want static rash? I mean, and it's usually clothing distributed. It can itch like fire. And originally the bounce sheets had some fiberglass in them, so they would leave little pickers in your clothing. So they went and reformulated the sheet. But any of them are not bounce particularly, Downy, Snuggle, Cling Free, whatever. Now people put these little balls in their dryer that they beat the clothes up. There's no chemicals in there, so it beats the static electricity away. But we don't personally use fabric softeners in my home with dryers because they're in the clothing.
That's fascinating to hear. Well, we're going to take a short break, but we'll come right back with Dr. Ronnie Daigle. You're watching Healthwise here on RTV KDCG Television.